Welcome to your lecture video about life during the 1930s and the different cultural things that happened during the 1930s. We're going to be covering a lot of different things, including minority groups. So let's just jump right into it. Let's start off with women. We know that the New Deal helps provide a lot of relief from the Depression, and the New Deal matters enormously because it changes the role of the federal government and it adds to the power of the presidency and it changes the relationship between the presidency and the government to the American people. But specifically talking about women, the New Deal did provide women with the opportunity to increase their political influence and promote the fight for women's rights. First and foremost was probably Eleanor Roosevelt, who was FDR's wife. She transforms the office of the First Lady from a ceremonial role to a position of actual action and deep involvement in the political process. Representing the president, she tours the nation. She would visit farms, Indian reservations, she would travel deep into coal mines, and she would help FDR with his campaigns and offer him advice on political or on policy issues. She was his eyes and ears out on the street, especially with him dealing with polio. Now, the Roosevelt administrations included the first female cabinet woman, Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, which we've talked about before, and she played a leading role in establishing Social Security and to also win the approval of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which we know ended child labor and established a minimum wage. However, the New Deal does not fight to end gender discrimination in the workplace. In fact, some New Deal programs didn't employ women at all, like the CCC, and many New Deal programs would make a much greater effort to employ men first before actually giving the job to a female. Now, if we talk about African Americans, when the Depression hit, African Americans were often the first to lose their job. By 1934, the unemployment rate for African Americans were almost 50%, more than twice the national average. And Eleanor Roosevelt and others urged the president to improve the situation specifically for African Americans. As the New Deal progressed, Eleanor Roosevelt increases her position of power to protest against racial discrimination. The president invited many African American leaders to advise him, and these unofficial advisors become known as the Black Cabinet. Nevertheless, Roosevelt did not always follow the advice of his Black Cabinet. Racial discrimination and injustice continued to plague the African Americans. When the NAACP launched a ad or a campaign in favor of federal anti-lynching law, the president refused to support it and told black leaders that he could not support an anti-lynching law because if he did, then the Southern Democrats wouldn't pass any of the laws that he tried to get through. So no civil rights reform laws were passed at all during the 1930s. Attempting to improve the lives of Native Americans, the Roosevelt administration made some changes in some long-standing policies that had existed. The 1887 Dawes Act, which took tribal lands and divided them into smaller pots, was one of the acts that he tried to change because it made it clear that that act had actually worsened the condition of the Native American living standard than actually improved it. Of the original 138 million acres of land that the Native Americans owned, 48 million was just too poor to farm. And to prevent further land loss and to improve the living conditions for Native Americans, the Indian New Deal was created. So the Indian New Deal was a program that gave Indians economic assistance and greater control over their own affairs. New schools, new hospitals were built. The practice of Indian religions, native languages, and traditional customs were actually encouraged. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, considered the centerpiece, which is considered the centerpiece of the New Deal, restored tribal control over Native American lands. So the Native Americans definitely did have their life or their lives improved during the New Deal process and during the 1930s. Although the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 didn't necessarily improve it immediately, it definitely gave Native Americans a greater control over their destiny, and it helped to change things for future generations. Harder times came upon the Mexican Americans. As more Okies, remember the people from Oklahoma that were dealing with the Dust Bowl, were moving out west, the competition for jobs between those migrants and Mexican American farm workers in states like California started to really heat up. So a flood of workers struggled to find jobs, to keep jobs, and often Mexican Americans were the ones that were faced with the additional burden of discrimination, and now we're competing with white farmhands for these jobs. In the Southwest, many white Americans would or clamored for Mexican American reparation. And that involved the efforts of local, state, and federal governments to basically encourage or trick Mexican immigrants and their children to return to Mexico. Hundreds of thousands of people of Mexican ancestry, many of them were actually born in the US, were pushed out of the US and forced to move back to Mexico. By the end of the 1930s, Mexican Americans were working in most industries in the Southwest, including farming, ranching, and industry, if they did end up remaining in the U.S. But as you see the statistic in front of you, over 400,000 were deported, again, including American-born citizens. Now, during the Great Depression, many people resented having to compete with Asians for jobs. The United States passed laws limiting the number of Asians allowed into the country and encouraged them to leave as well. The Reparation Act of 1935 gave free transportation to the Philippines or to the Filipinos that were in the U.S. that agreed to return to the Philippines and to not come back. Now, this New Deal creates a new political coalition, or the New Deal Coalition. And basically, this coalition brings together people that hadn't necessarily been brought together before. You would have Southern whites, Northern blue collar workers, immigrants, poor Midwestern farmers, African Americans, all voting for FDR. Now, before the New Deal, most African Americans actually voted Republican because that was the party of Lincoln. And we know that Lincoln freed the slaves. So things start to change with FDR during the 1930s when African Americans actually began to vote Democratic. Besides forging a powerful political coalition, Roosevelt and the New Deal helps to unify the nation, and social and ethnic divisions that were around during the 1920s and before were diminished significantly in the 1930s. So let's talk about government expanding. The New Deal programs greatly increased the size and the power of the federal government. And the government began to do things it had never done before, like withholding taxes directly from workers' paychecks to distribute to the elderly, for example. Though the New Deal didn't end the Depression, it helped to restore the American economy. And with the New Deal, the federal government breaks apart from the traditions of laissez-faire, or from leaving the economy alone, which they had done before and we had talked about before with Rockefeller and Carnegie and those people. FDR's rejections of laissez-faire policies leads to a number of New Deal critics, which we've also talked about, that accused him of promoting socialism. However, many New Deal measures actually strengthen capitalism and help make the economic boom that comes during World War II and after a possibility. So the New Deal affects millions of people, workers, and their families. We're going to make a country in which no one is left out. That was what FDR would say to Francis Perkins. And many of the programs that the New Deal created and that FDR created helped to realize this goal, which leads to a welfare state in the United States, and where the government assumes responsibility for providing for the welfare of children, poor people, elderly, sick, disabled, and unemployed. The creation of this welfare state is a major change in government policy. With the exception of military vets, most Americans never really received any direct benefits from the federal government prior to the New Deal. State and local governments, private charities, or your family and friends were basically the safety net for needy Americans. And even though the New Deal did not achieve his idea of a country in which no one is left out, because many people don't receive Social Security, it still establishes the idea that the federal government is responsible for Americans' well being and for the Americans' welfare. In the later half of the 20th century, the reach for the government programs actually continues to grow. So the New Deal reforms provided the framework for the debate over the proper role of federal government in the private lives of Americans. And it energizes liberals who would push for an even greater role in the federal government, for the federal government in future years. But the troubled conservatives will see that the expansion of the federal government is actually going to place a limit on Americans' rights. And indeed, this is something that we still continue to discuss today. With the expansion of government, that obviously is going to change the role of a presidency. In no area did FDR have a greater impact than on the actual office of the presidency itself. The expanding role of government, including a lot of the new agencies that he created, gave the executive power, or the executive branch, more power. FDR also affected the style of his presidency, the way that he would use radio with his fireside chats to captivate Americans, his close relations with the press, was something that no other president had really done before. Later during World War II, and we'll talk about this at a later date, FDR's presidential power grows even more as he becomes the commander-in-chief of the nation's armed forces. After the war, the American people, or the government, people in government, sought to protect this balance between the different branches and between the federal and state governments. And one of the ways that Americans sought to basically guard against the growing power of the presidency was to amend the Constitution. When Roosevelt ran for an unprecedented third term in 1940, which no other president had attempted, he knew that he was breaking an unwritten rule that was established by George Washington. George Washington only served two terms, and every other president afterwards followed the same suit. So when he won that election in 1930 and then, surprise, runs again in 1944, people were going crazy. But with Roosevelt's death in 1945, there was a growing call for placing a limit on the president's term in office. And in 1951, you have the 22nd Amendment to our Constitution that was ratified, and that limits the president to 2 consecutive terms, which is what we have now. And there is a typo in the word consecutive. It's missing an E between the S and the C, so just keep that in mind. So let's talk a little bit about culture and about movies and radio. Mass entertainment, like The Wizard of Oz, flourishes during the New Deal years as many Americans sought to go to the movies to kind of express the depression and the worries of the depression. And for the first time in years, the government actually plays an active role in the arts, creating programs that would put artists to work. So it became a golden age of entertainment, and the movies, music, works, and literature that was produced during this era definitely holds a unique place in American culture. So entertainment becomes a big business during the 1930s. Large radio networks like NBC and CBS were broadcasting giants, and you also had film companies that became giants as well, like MGM, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, Paramount, all names that you guys are very familiar with. By 1935, 2 out of every 3 homes owned a radio, and by the end of the decade, 9 out of 10 did. So by 1939, nearly 2/3 of Americans attended at least one movie a week. And magazines that would track stars' personal lives and professional lives, so basically like gossip magazines, became a staple as well. Above all, when Americans went to the movies during the Great Depression, they wanted to escape. So they sought relief from what they were going through. So they wanted to get a good laugh, they wanted to get a good cry, they wanted to sing to a good song or see good triumph over evil. And The Wizard of Oz is probably one of the most memorable Depression-era films that delivered on all of those. It promised weary audiences that their dreams really would come true. The big movie studios churned out musicals, romantic comedies, and gangster films Children would marvel at the animation from Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And for a good scare, teens and young adults would go to see Frankenstein. Adults watch dancers glide across the floor in top hat, and many would cry as we would see Gone with the Wind. And of course, King Kong, with its innovative special effects, would definitely make for a huge box office hit. In the early 1930s, many films represented the public's mistrust of big business and government. So gangster films like Public Enemy were very popular, and these films shown a declining faith in government and law enforcement, with the characters turning to crime to resolve or to survive the Depression. But as the New Deal restored confidence in Americans, the government slowly regained its glow, and the movies began to portray government officials as heroes, which is portrayed in the movie G-Men. Other films would focus on the strength of just the average American and the average American succeeding, and that could be seen in the movie Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. The national radio networks also became very popular. And for those that couldn't get to the movies, you would listen to your shows on the radio, and you would have soap operas, variety shows, you would have comedians such as Bill Rogers. Dramatic shows were very popular, like The Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger started in 1933 and went on for more than 20 years. And you also had a detective series that was called The Shadow, and it began each episode with the line, "Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men?" So before TV, this is what people used to do for fun. In addition to providing entertainment, the radio, the family radio also provides obvious information. And we know that FDR provided information with the fireside chats to explain and promote his New Deal programs. And then, of course, you'd get the daily news and the political commentary. So the radio was pretty big in the world of the average American family. On at least one occasion, though, radio listeners would have a hard time recognizing the difference between news and entertainment. And this happened on the night of October 30th, 1939. Millions of Americans tuned in to listen to the drama called War of the Worlds. And the drama or the broadcast was so realistic that people actually thought Martians were really invading the US, and panic began to go all over the countries until the announcers finally had to insist and announce that it was make believe and it was just a play and it wasn't real, but still people freaked out. So let's talk a little bit about music, arts, and literature. Like films and radio, music provides a diversion from the hard times. You don't want to constantly have to be reminded that you're dead broke and you don't have a job. So whether you're listening to the radio at home or you were dancing in the nightclubs, Americans would definitely enjoy popular music. And swing music was what all the big bands would play, and that was what was topping the charts. Latin music also became very popular, and the rhythms of the rumba or the samba had a special appeal for dancers, and Latin bands were also featured in films and on radio. Folk and ethnic music also gained a following during the 1930s, and black singers started to focus on the harsh conditions that African Americans were facing, and so they were turning to music as an outlet to get out their aggression. During the New Deal, the 1930s, the federal government provides funding for the arts for the first time in American history, recognizing that many artists and writers couldn't really or didn't really have any other skills to participate in any New Deal program. The WPA establishes a special branch that was just for artists, and they would title things like Federal Art Project or the Federal Writers Project or the Federal Theater Project, and it would offer a variety of job opportunities for people in this field. In the federally funded theater projects, musicians and actors would put together performances that were often free and to the public, and that would help to, give people some entertainment as well. And artists would paint huge and dramatic murals on public buildings across the nation, and these paintings were celebrated as accomplishments of the workers who helped build the nation. Many of these murals are actually still around today. Photographers also benefited from the federal arts programs, and the Resettlement and Farm Security Administration, the FSA, sought to document the plight of American farmers. And there you go with the migrant mother, which we've already discussed in class. And then some of the members of Congress would actually attack these programs and they would say that they're promoting radical values. But Eleanor Roosevelt and other people actually defended these programs on the grounds that they didn't believe in censoring anything. Nevertheless, eventually Congress starts to, or congressional support starts to decline, and these programs ceased to exist by the early 1940s. But it did help set a precedent for further funding, federal funding for the arts and humanities in the 1960s. The most famous book ever written in the 1930s was The Grapes of Wrath. Now, The Grapes of Wrath follows a fictional family that is leaving their home in Oklahoma that's been, destroyed by the Dust Bowls, and they're moving out to California and where they hope to have a better life. But instead of the promised land, they encounter exploitation, disease, hunger, political corruption, kind of what the average American family was going through. Um, Native Son, which is actually written by an African American author, also would capture the plight of blacks facing the Depression and discrimination. And it explores racial prejudice in the northern urban setting, which was something that wasn't necessarily explored very often. On the lighter note, though, many Americans started to devour comic strips and comic books in the 1930s. The most popular were probably Dick Tracy and the first great superhero, Superman. So that is a wrap, guys. Make sure you're able to answer these questions, and I shall see you guys tomorrow in class.